everyone, Mrs. Ortega here. I am getting ready to go over chapter 41 with you today. In this chapter, we're going to look at animal nutrition. So we'll take a look at what are essential nutrients and the digestive system as well. So the need to feed. Every animal needs to take in some sort of food. Those foods taken in, taken apart, and then taken up in the process of animal nutrition. And so in general, overall, animals fall into three categories. Herbivores will eat plants and algae. Carnivores will eat other animals or meat. And omnivores eat a combination of both. And so those three categories are based on the type of food that they eat and are very well known. There are other types of feeders as well that we'll take a look at in terms of how they consume their food. But overall, an animal's diet must provide the chemical energy for cellular processes, for cellular respiration, making ATP and other processes, building enzymes, proteins, molecules for cells that are needed for daily life. Also, organic building block for macromolecules, getting amino acids to make protein, monosaccharides to make polysaccharides, parts of lipids to make fats, and then nucleic acids to make up DNA and RNA. And then lastly, a diet must provide essential nutrients. We'll take a look at these essential nutrients in the next section here. Essential nutrients are materials that an animal cannot make on their own within their own body. They cannot assemble from simpler organic molecules. And so these are called essential nutrients that they must be obtained from the animal's diet. And so there are four classes of essential nutrients. Those are essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, vitamins, and minerals. This next picture here, we'll look at an example. So here we can see four components, the four essential nutrients. The first one is vitamin. So here, vitamin B3. Vitamin B3 is an essential vitamin. Then we have here our fatty acid, our essential fatty acid of the linoleic acid is an essential fatty acid. Here it's converting it to a different form. Then we have iron, which is a mineral. So that is another one of the groups of essential nutrients. And then lastly, essential amino acid. So there's vitamin, minerals, essential amino acids, and then essential fatty acids. So let's take a look at those groups here. First one being essential amino acids. As you may remember, there are 20 amino acids to make up proteins, and animals can make about half of those from their diet. The remaining ones, the essential amino acids, must be obtained from the food in a pre-assembled form. And so those must come from the diet. They cannot be made within the animal themselves. And so products or foods such as meat, eggs, and cheese have all of the essential amino acids, typically about 8. There are 8 essential amino acids for humans, and therefore would be complete proteins, source of proteins. But for plants, they are incomplete in their amino acid composition and will usually be lacking 1 or 2 of those essential amino acids. And so individuals that only eat plants must get specific combinations to get all essential amino acids. And so the key there is to make sure you consume both a grain, like a wheat, soybean, corn, with a legume, which is pinto beans or other types of beans. And so a grain and legume together will you'll get all essential amino acids. And so over time, cultures have identified that and put those in their staples. For the Middle Eastern cultures of hummus and pita, pita will be the grain and hummus would be the legume. For Central American cultures, rice and beans, grain and legume will get all the essential amino acids. For American culture of a peanut butter sandwich, the wheat and the grain, legume, the peanut butter, peanut would get all the essential amino acids. So it's not a requirement to consume meat to get all essential amino acids. And so some animals have adaptations that help them when their bodies demand extraordinary amounts of proteins. But we'll focus on overall essential amino acids are needed from the diet, and that they are one of 4 essential nutrients. So here's essential fatty acids. So most of the fatty acids can be made, can be synthesized that we need. The essential ones must be obtained from the diet and contain unsaturated fatty acids with 1 or more double bonds in their fatty acid tail. Overall, though, deficiencies in fatty acids are very rare, and so usually in your typical diet, you will get the essential fatty acids that you need. So on to the third essential nutrient are the vitamins. The vitamins are organic molecules. They have carbon in their structure, and they're required in the diet in very small amounts. There are 13 vitamins essential for humans, and these are grouped into fat-soluble versus water-soluble. You can see those here. So water-soluble vitamins include the vitamin Bs 1 through 12 and vitamin C. Then fat-soluble vitamins, vitamins A, D, E, and K. You can see there. You can see dietary sources, major functions in the body, and symptoms of deficiency. And while these are very interesting and very cool, this is nothing I ask you to memorize. So don't try to memorize this this chart here. But I do like to look at vitamin C. You can see it's found mostly in fruits, broccoli, and tomatoes. And deficiencies of this is a result of scurvy, which it was common in people who were on ships in the earlier centuries, traveling on their ships. They were not able to bring with them fruits and tomatoes and broccoli, as those weren't able to be preserved well. And so as a result, most of them typically had a vitamin C deficiency that resulted in scurvy. So those are the vitamins. On to the last group here, the minerals. Minerals are inorganic. So they're not going to have carbon, so no carbon in their skeleton or in their structure. Oh. Let's try that again. No carbon in their structure. And so ingesting large amounts of minerals can upset the homeostasis balance. So that's not recommended, but getting them in small amounts is recommended. And so you can see the list of those here. And minerals like calcium, phosphorus, sulfur, potassium, sodium, chlorine, magnesium, iron, iodine, fluorine. Some of these you may be familiar with already. But again, nothing to memorize here. All right, so looking at dietary deficiencies, malnutrition is defined as a failure to obtain adequate nutrition. This is usually due to lack of sources from the environment, to lack of food in the environment. that can have huge impacts on health and survival rate of the populations. And so deficiencies in these essential nutrients can cause anywhere from deformities to disease and even death. There are many different examples of how animals will try to prevent deficiencies. Here you can see cattle, deer, and other herbivores will consume concentrated sources of salt to prevent phosphorus deficiency. We humans have tried to find different ways to get all the nutrients from our food sources, especially in those areas where the food sources are very limited. Examples of golden rice, which is an engineered strain of rice to include beta carotene, which is converted to vitamin A in the body. Overall, though, malnutrition is a failure to obtain adequate nutrition, usually due to the sources available do not have enough food. Compare that to undernutrition, where the diet, undernutrition results when the diet does not provide enough chemical energy. And so in this case, the organism could be ingesting a lot of food, but the food that they are ingesting does not provide enough energy. So an undernourished individual can use up stored fat and carbs. They can result in breaking down their own muscle proteins, which results in lost muscle mass, suffer protein deficiency of the brain, and either suffer irreversible damage or die as a result of undernourishment. And so overall, though, many people don't quite understand the difference between malnutrition and undernutrition. Malnutrition is where the lack of food source comes into play, whereas undernourished individuals may have the ability to get all of the essential nutrients and all the essential food. They just, for whatever reason, do not. And so an example would be bulimic or anorexic people in the United States do most of the time have access to all the food that they would need to get all the essential nutrients. However, due to their illness and their condition, it prevents them from ingesting it, and so that is an undernourished individual, is undernutrition, whereas a malnourished individual does not have access to those food sources. So I hope that clarifies it just a bit. And so that brings us into the food processing stage. So what are the processes of taking in food? The first part is ingesting, which is the act of eating or feeding. That is taking the food in and bringing it into the organism for the processing of breaking it apart. Which would be the next stage. Digestion is when that food is going to be broken down into tiny pieces, small enough for the body to absorb. And so that would be the third stage, where the nutrients get absorbed into the body. And then waste is eliminated in the fourth stage here. And so a lot of people get ingestion and digestion confused. Ingestion is taking in the food. Digestion is breaking it apart. So I believe this is one of those things you want to know the 4 stages of. All right, and so different types of feeders are shown next. The first one is suspension feeder, where animals will sift for small food particles from the water. Here you can see a big whale filter feeding for food, for small krill or plankton. Other examples of suspension feeders would be the sponges that we saw in the invertebrates chapter. Right, the second type of feeder would be the substrate feeder. This isn't any animal that lives in or on their food source. Here you can see a caterpillar ingesting its food source, which is the leaf that it lives on, leaving behind a trail of feces behind it. Another example of a substrate feeder would be an earthworm. As it eats its way through the soil, it's going to also leave a trail of feces behind it. But it's living in or on their food source would be a substrate feeder. And then a fluid feeder is going to suck nutrient-rich fluid from a living host. And here in this example is a mosquito. The female mosquitoes will suck blood from different animals, and so that is their source of food. So they are fluid feeders. Then lastly here, bulk feeders. Bulk feeders will be most animals, and they will eat large pieces of food. Shown here, a python eating what looks to be an antelope will be eating that food or digesting that food for a very long time, so won't need to eat again. But other animals may not eat as large pieces of food. And so here it shows you the physical description of the stages. Digestion is a process of breaking food down into molecules that will be small enough to absorb. So in digestion, there's a kind of subdivision. Mechanical digestion is a physical process of breaking apart food to increase the surface area of the food. Chemical digestion is going to be splitting those molecules small enough so that way they can pass into the cell. And so that is going to be chemical digestion, where that molecule of food is small enough that it can enter a cell. And so in chemical digestion, it happens through splitting bonds with molecules by adding water. And so water is needed for chemical digestion. Absorption is going to be taking those nutrients in by the cells of the body. And then lastly, elimination is passing that undigested material out of the system. And so now that we've understood the different nutrients along with different types of eating and different stages of eating, we'll look at some different digestive compartments of different animals. So most animals process food in specialized compartments. This will reduce the risk of an animal digesting its own cells and tissues, and also getting all the nutrients out to all the cells of the body. And so looking at intracellular digestion, food particles are going to be engulfed by phagocytosis. So that is within the cell. Cells will take in food particles by the process of phagocytosis, something you may be familiar with from Bio 1. And so food vacuoles are then formed that will fuse with the lysosome, which is an organelle within the cell that will break apart that food. But extracellular digestion is what we'll focus on. So extracellular digestion is breaking down the food outside of the cells. It occurs in compartments that are a part of the animal's body. And so an example of this with a simple body plan is the gastrovascular cavity that we saw in previous chapters, that they function in both the digestion and distribution of the nutrients. And so you can see that here in this next picture of the hydra digesting the Daphnia food particle here, and that it has swallowed that food through its mouth, and now it's in the gastrovascular cavity, where the gastrodermal layer will release digestive enzymes from a gland cell. Those enzymes will break down the food into small particles that are then engulfed by phagocytosis and digested into food vacuoles. Those food vacuoles fuse with the lysosomes, break down the molecules of food into small enough molecules to be used by the cell. and then they're spread to the epidermal layer to be used by all cells. And so then waste is generated, and then waste is pushed out into the gastrovascular cavity, where then it will expel out of the mouth. But more complex animals have different openings, so a mouth and an anus, and so a complete digestive tract is called an alimentary canal, and so this is what we will look at for some different animals, in that it has different regions that carry out different parts of digestion and absorption. So you can see those here. The first one's the earthworm. The earthworm starts out by taking in soil through the opening of the mouth. The pharynx pulls the soil in, and then the soil goes from the pharynx to the crop through the esophagus. So in the crop, it's temporarily stored until the gizzard is able to grind it up. And from there, it goes into the intestine where nutrients are absorbed, and then any waste leaves through the anus. Looking at the grasshopper, again, taking food in from the mouth, it's temporarily stored in the crop where it has to pass through the esophagus. The gastric caecae will release enzymes that will start to digest and break that food apart, where then it's going to be absorbed here and not shown in the midgut, or sorry, in the hindgut. Midgut here is for chemical digestion. Hindgut will be for absorption, and then lastly, waste is stored in the rectum, excreted through the anus. Then here, lastly, the bird, again taking food in from the mouth, going to the crop through the esophagus. It's temporarily stored in the crop. Then goes to the stomach for digestion, for mechanical digestion. And gizzard for further digestion, more chemical in nature. Intestine will absorb the nutrients, and then lastly, waste expelled through the anus. So all these are examples of different alimentary canals and how they have a starting point, the mouth, different processing points here, esophagus, crop, intestine, and then the ending point there, the anus. And so that brings us to the human system, or the mammalian digestive system, is what we'll take a look at next. And we'll look at the different parts and different components of the digestive system. But overall, we have some kind of unifying features here. So that it consists of an alimentary canal. It also has accessory glands that will secrete digestive juice, and this comes through ducts. And so looking at the accessory glands, those are the salivary glands, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. And so as we look at the alimentary canal and the digestive system, we'll see that food is going to be pushed along through a process called peristalsis, which is rhythmic contractions of muscles in the wall of the canal. You can think of like squeezing a tube of toothpaste is going to contract right behind the food that it wants to move along. It's going to relax the muscle right in front of the food. That way it allows for movement of that food in the forward direction. And so that's a unifying feature you'll see throughout the alimentary canal, along with sphincters. These are valves that regulate the movement in between compartments. So kind of like drawstrings on a hoodie, these will open and close to allow food to enter or exit different compartments. And so here you can see the human digestive system. So the starting point is the oral cavity. From there it goes to the pharynx, to the esophagus, then to the stomach. And from the stomach, it'll go to the small intestine, then the large intestine, then the rectum and anus. So we'll look at those different compartments along with the accessory glands of liver, gallbladder, pancreas, and salivary, salivary glands. So starting with the oral cavity here, this will be the first stage of digestion. This is a mechanical digestion, so physical breaking apart of food. And so to do that, first you have the salivary glands will deliver saliva to lubricate the food. This will aid in balancing out any acids or acidic food or basic food. Saliva will contain a various mixture that will allow for a little bit of pH balance. It also will have amylase, which will start breaking down the starch or polysaccharides into maltose. And so that will break it down to smaller disaccharide sugars. And then for saliva itself, usually about 1 liter saliva is made a day, which is a lot of saliva to help break down that food. Along with the saliva, you'll have the teeth that will chew the food into smaller particles. So teeth, they come in different forms and fashions for different animals. Some have sharper teeth to rip tough meat apart. Others have more of a grinding type teeth to grind plant materials into smaller pieces. Also with saliva, you have mucus, which is secreted. And this is a viscous mixture of water, salts, cells, and glycoproteins that will help in digesting and breaking apart that food. So not also to mention the saliva is slightly acidic in nature to help destroy any bacteria that comes with the food. All right, and so the tongue will shape the food into a round structure we call the bolus, and this will be helpful with swallowing, along with the tongue will help swallow the food from the oral cavity to the pharynx region, which will quickly pass into the esophagus. And so the pharynx region is a junction that opens between the esophagus and the windpipe, which is called the trachea. And so let's take a look at that here. So looking at the oral cavity, you can see the mouth, the tongue, not showing our teeth, along with the bolus of food that's about to be swallowed. But before it's swallowed in a normal state, we have the pharynx region, which is at the back of the throat here. Right, come on. Right there, so that's the pharynx region. And so from there, the food will go into the pharynx region, and as of the swallowing triggers different things here. That the first off, the epiglottis feature, which you see here in normal state, is pointed upwards. This will go downwards to cover the trachea, which will be right there when that swallowing happens. So a swallow will trigger the epiglottis to go from an up to down position, along with the sphincter that contracts with the esophagus. The sphincter contracting will be relaxed. So just a moment here. Okay, sorry about that. Anyways, looking at here, the swallowing effect is going to move the epiglottis from an up position to a down position. So this switch will now cover the trachea, which is normally open to allow for breathing. So it's temporarily closed off in order to get that bolus of food to the esophagus. And so here you can see the sphincter will relax, allowing the food to go through to the esophagus, where then it goes to the stomach. And so if you're caught in a food going down the wrong pipe, it's usually due to the fact that you or someone is breathing right before they swallow. And so that doesn't give the epiglottis enough time to switch from up to down position before that swallowing of food or water takes place. And so the result is it may get stuck in the trachea where it has to be coughed back up to the pharynx region in order to, cough back up into that region in order to go down the correct pipe, the esophagus, to the stomach. And so you do want to know this this portion of the epiglottis when it's up versus when it's down, where the esophagus is open, where the trachea is open. You want to know those different components here. All right, so now that the food goes from the esophagus to the stomach in about, I think, 4 to 6 seconds, then the stomach will store the food and begin digestion of proteins. And so it does it through something called gastric juice. So it converts this meal, this bolus of food, into a liquid state called chyme. This gastric juice is very acidic. It has a low pH, about 2, that kills bacteria and denatures and unfolds proteins. It's made up of 2 main molecules, hydrochloric acid and pepsin, which is a protease, which is also known as a protein digesting enzyme. So it's going to break apart proteins into smaller peptides. And so how do our cells make this gastric juice, they may ask. There are different cells will secrete different molecules. The parietal cells will secrete hydrogen and chloride ions. So hydrogen H plus and chloride Cl minus ions separately into the cavity of the stomach. And from there, they will combine to make the hydrochloric acid HCl. Chief cells will secrete pepsinogen molecule, which gets activated to pepsin when it's mixed with an acid. So hydrochloric acid in the stomach will then form pepsin, and that will start breaking down proteins. Mucus is also secreted. This protects the stomach lining from gastric juice, which is very acidic, can be very corrosive. But overall, stomach cells are replaced every 3 days anyways. And so if they are damaged, they will get replaced in about 3 days. However, when certain things can occur, like gastric ulcers, these are lesions in the lining of the stomach. These are broken cells, broken areas of the stomach, and this is caused mostly by the bacterium H. pylori or Helicobacter pylori. And so let's take a look at the stomach cells here. So this is the interior of the stomach on the top, and so looking at these pits, you can see they go quite far down, and so in those pits they have different cells that will secrete different molecules that will then go out of the pit into the cavity of the stomach. And so here you can see the mucus cells in this dark pink or red, the chief cells in a lighter pink, and then parietal cells in yellow. So parietal cells will, as you can see in this next image here, secrete the ions of hydrogen chlorine ions that combine to make the acid in the cavity of the stomach. Then the chief cells secrete pepsinogen that gets activated to pepsin with the presence of the acid. And so those two things form gastric juice that will then convert that meal into a liquid state called chyme. And so the stomach will contract and relax muscles to churn and to rotate the contents of the stomach. And the line has sphincters on both ends to prevent chyme from entering the esophagus and to regulate when it enters the small intestine. And so an empty stomach can result in pangs for an excessive, amount of time. can result in pangs, and then stomach churning can result in that stomach gurgling noise that can be detected when you're hungry. So now let's look at how digestion occurs in the small intestine. So the stomach processes the food for about 2 to 6 hours, and then it moves into the small intestine. This is the longest compartment of our human alimentary canal, where hydrolysis of those macromolecules occurs. And so it's going to break that food apart from those large macromolecules to the smallest ones so they can get absorbed by the cells. And so the first portion of the small intestine is called the duodenum or duodenum. This is where the chyme from the stomach will mix with different digestive juices and start the process of chemical digestion, or continue the process of chemical digestion. You can see that different digestion portions here. So carbohydrates in green, proteins in purple, nucleic acid in red, and fat digestion in yellow. These are the 4 macromolecules that are broken apart. And so at the small intestine stage, you can see enzymes from pancreas and then enzymes from the intestinal epithelium. So that's from the small intestine cells themselves, what kind of enzymes they secrete that help break apart the food. And so you can see here there are a lot of enzymes secreted from the pancreas that will break apart all 4 types of macromolecules. So including in those secretions, there are protein digesting enzymes or proteases, trypsin and chymotrypsin. These are activated in the lumen or the cavity of the duodenum. And so from there, they will start breaking apart those polypeptides into smaller peptides. This solution will be alkaline or basic and will neutralize that acidic chyme from the stomach. In terms of liver, so the liver is going to make something called bile. Bile is going to aid in digesting and breaking apart of fats. So fat molecules are broken apart by this bile and then into smaller pieces, and then from there they get absorbed into the cells. And so this bile is made in the liver and is stored in the gallbladder. This also is responsible for destroying non-functional red blood cells. And then from the small intestine cells themselves, they'll also secrete enzymes that will help in chemically digesting this food. And so that will complete chemical digestion as the peristalsis movement moves chyme along the small intestine. So most of that digestion will occur in the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Second and third components of the small intestine will absorb nutrients. And so to absorb the most amount of nutrients, the small intestine is going to have the largest surface area. This is due to several different things. The first one is villi. These are finger-like projections that are on the lumen or the cavity of the small intestine. And also microvilli. Microvilli will be on the individual cells. And so we'll take a look at that here. And so this surface creates what we call a brush border that will increase the rate of nutrients. So the more surface that you have, the more nutrients can get across that surface and get into the cell. And so it makes it much more efficient to have more surface area in the small intestine. And so the actual transport into the cells can be a passive transport or an active transport, and it depends on the nutrient, and that's something we won't really look at in this chapter. But overall here you can see the structure of the small intestine. It has different muscle layers shown here to help move that food along. It's connected to the circulatory system through blood capillaries that will the nutrients will get transported to and then circulate through the body. And then you see the brush border, the highly folded surface on the small intestine. If you zoom in on that, you can see the finger-like projections called the villi. So each villi will have a capillary system, and the lacteal, which is part of the lymphatic vessel system in its interior. And when looking on the surface of the villi, each cell has little hair-like projections as well, and these are called microvilli. And so that's forming the actual brush border on the surface of the cells. And so many people get villi and microvilli confused, and you do want to keep those separate. Microvilli are on the cells, villi are finger-like projections in the small intestine. In terms of fats, how are fats absorbed into the system? First, the epithelial cells have to absorb the fatty acid tails and the monoglycerides separately, and then recombine them into triglycerides. And so the fats have to be broken apart first completely. This is done by the bile and other intestinal enzymes. Then they're moved into the cell, and then from there they're recombined back into triglycerides. Then they form larger structures called chylomicrons, which are then transported into the lymphatic vessel, the lacteal. And so this will then go to large veins that return blood to the heart. And so you can see that step portion here. Triglycerides are broken down into fatty acids, monoglycerides transported into the cell, then recombined into triglycerides, then form chylomicrons, and then are transported out of the cell into the lacteal lymphatic system. So overall, that's a process there. So this video here goes over some membrane transport. It may be kind of a summary of some BIOL 1 stuff. I'll go ahead and play it for your viewing purposes.
We get all our energy and organic molecules from food. Before we can use the molecules we eat, they have to enter our cells, starting with the cells lining the small intestine. Let's zoom in to the surface of a cell. The plasma membrane is selectively permeable. Some molecules can move across it, while others cannot. How do materials enter and leave cells? Lipids, such as these yellow molecules, can dissolve in the lipid bilayer. Notice how they move down their concentration gradient, from where they are more concentrated to where they are less concentrated. This is an example of diffusion. Diffusion is a form of passive transport. It does not require energy from the cell. Most molecules can't cross the lipid bilayer. Here, the sugar fructose moves into intestinal cells by facilitated diffusion, moving down its concentration gradient through a transport protein. Facilitated diffusion doesn't require energy from the cell, so it's also a form of passive transport. Water crosses the plasma membrane by facilitated diffusion, or by diffusing across the lipid bilayer directly. The diffusion of water across a membrane is called osmosis. The sodium-potassium pump moves ions against their concentration gradient, from where they are less concentrated to where they are more concentrated. This requires energy from the cell and is known as active transport. Energy from ATP is used to move sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions in. Another type of active transport is co-transport. Here, both sodium ions and glucose move into the cell through a co-transporter protein. Sodium ions move down the concentration gradient created by the sodium-potassium pump, and glucose moves against its concentration gradient. Now let's move to the other side of our intestinal cell. Materials can be exported in vesicles that fuse with the plasma membrane and release their contents outside the cell. This process is called exocytosis. In endocytosis, the plasma membrane pinches in, forming a vesicle that contains material from outside the cell. On this side of the cell, we can also see oxygen and carbon dioxide diffusing across the lipid bilayer. Cells use all these processes to get what we need.
Okay, that was a nice little summary of membrane transport. Now looking at the large intestine, as that food moves through the small intestine, eventually it will reach the large intestine, where it will meet the colon, the cecum, and the appendix. So looking at the colon, this is where the food's going to continue on. And the large intestine and the colon region, water is going to be absorbed, and that will then form a firm excrement that will then be eventually excreted out through the anus. Other structures in the large intestine are the cecum. This will aid in fermentation of plant material. This is also where large and small intestines meet. And the last one here is the appendix. This has a very minor role in immunity and still being overall studied for other functioning. And so let's take a look at those here. So here you can see the small intestine connecting to the large intestine. That will now be the colon. So there's an ascending portion of the colon, which is shown here, along with here, a transverse section here, and then the descending portion down here. And so all throughout the colon is going to reabsorb water. And in our human system, it's going to forming feces is going to have bacteria in the colon that will produce vitamins. Like vitamin K, these vitamins will be absorbed by the cells in the colon before the waste is eliminated. But before they're eliminated, they're stored in the rectum temporarily until they can be eliminated through the anus. So there is two sphincters that regulate the movement between the rectum and the anus that controls bowel movements. So here, lastly, in picture are the cecum and the appendix in this picture. The cecum will aid in digesting or fermentation of that plant material that's largely undigested by our human systems. But in other animals, the cecum has expanded and will contain microbes that will help in digesting those cellulose and lignin polymers. And then here you can see also the appendix. The appendix has some minor role in immunity, but most people are familiar with appendixes that become infected or inflamed, resulting in a large pain in the right side, lower side of the body, and they can be removed without any significant loss of function in the digestive system. So that brings us to the end of the human digestive system. In the next video, I will pick up here where we will look at evolutionary adaptations of digestive systems and how they're correlated with their diet. But for now, we'll just go ahead and say bye-bye.